Hi class, I would like to take a look at signal phrases and how you use them. So if we look under content, information for paper 2, we're going to see this handout kind of has a long title, Signal Phrases or Attributive Tags are an essential element of research writing. So I'm going to scroll down and just kind of show you some examples of words you might use when you create a signal phrase. First, let's look at some of those. Discusses, explains, remarks, says, states, analyzes, holds, indicates, warns, suggests, alleges, adds, exemplifies, shows, acknowledges, agrees, concurs, confirms. You'll notice that I have these in different categories under different headings, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's go back up to the top of the handout. So signal phrases are what you use to introduce source material. It lets the reader know that you are about to use somebody else's words, somebody else's information. It also tells where the information, the source material, comes from. And depending on which word you use, those words I just mentioned, those verbs, you let the reader know sort of what you want them to think about that source material. Okay. So this next part, so how do you write a signal phrase? Signal phrases can be a single word, phrase, or sentence. Okay. They can appear before or after a quote, a paraphrase, or a summary. Typically, though, you're going to want it to appear before that. Okay, so usually it's at the beginning of your sentence. And yes, they often include verbs, and you have to make sure that the verb you choose to use actually fits what you're trying to convey, or it actually fits the I guess, state of mind or attitude of the source. Okay. And here are some examples. According to Karen Killow, director of the Learning Center, and then you might have a verb, or you might have just what she says. But if you wanted to use a verb, that's not using a verb, but if you wanted to use a verb, you might say, Karen Killow, director of the Learning Center, warns students that, okay, so you have to be very careful about what kind of verb you're using, what you're trying to convey to the reader. Here's some other advice. Remember to add quotation marks around direct quotes of someone else's words. You have to use quotation marks when you are using their exact words. When using signal phrases in a research paper, be sure to provide appropriate parenthetical citations for all quotes, paraphrases, and summaries. Okay. Now you might be under the impression that you are supposed to use a signal phrase only if you are using a direct quotation, like exactly what somebody says. But no, you really need to use a signal phrase whether you're quoting, summarizing, or paraphrasing. So let's look at these verbs again. So I've divided them up into categories, and we can tell that each of these categories sort of conveys a different tone. So if the author is just stating a point and it seems sort of neutral, then one of these words would work. Comments, notes, points out, explains, states, reports. Okay. If the author is making, or the source is making an observation or considering a point, you might use analyzes, evaluates, reveals, speculates, supposes, right? If the author is presenting an opinion, you want to convey that to the reader as well, so you might use a word like advises, implies, persuades, urges, declares. Okay, it's like stronger wording. If an author is supporting a point that was just made, or that he or she just made, adds, defends, demonstrates, describes, justifies. Okay. If the author is agreeing with an idea or someone else's point, then you might say acknowledges, affirms, agrees, confirms, concurs. Okay. Notice also that these verbs are in present tense. They're not in past tense. So we're using MLA style. And MLA style says that when you are using a signal phrase, when you're conveying what an author or a source is saying, it has to be written in present tense. So this is a really good handout to consult when you're trying to create a good signal phrase. And you're trying to avoid creating, like if you're using a quotation, you want to avoid what's called a dropped quotation. And I will talk about dropped quotations in another video.